Hello, these are flipped notes 9-2 on social influence in our social psychology unit. My Bitmoji is with her squad because this section is all about the influence of the group or the influence of your squad. So let's get right to it. So, social influence is how the actions of others shape the way we as individuals think and behave. Not necessarily just our friend group, but any others who are around us. Social roles are the defined patterns of behavior that are expected of persons in a given setting or group. So, what is your role when you're at school as a student? What is your social role as a member of your family when you're at home? So, your roles may result from your interests, abilities, and goals, or they could be imposed on you by the group or by cultural, economic, biological conditions. In any case, social roles are what help you know how to behave. They prescribe your behavior by making it obvious what you should do, how you should do it, and when. Social norms are the group's expectations regarding what is appropriate being the key word, and acceptable for its members' attitudes and behaviors. So these could be broad guidelines like political or religious views, policies, or they could be really specific, things like being quiet in a library. They can guide conversation about what's acceptable to discuss. They can explain dress code. They can be unwritten rules, but built into various situations, such as when a teacher is lecturing, students are to listen and to not talk simultaneously. But social norms are like normal behaviors in social settings. Conformity and obedience. Behavior is contagious. It's modeled by one and tends to be followed by another. And then we follow behavior of others to conform. So that's mainly what conformity is. So conformity leads to compliance, which leads to obedience, something we study here in social science. The chameleon effect basically is conformity, the idea that we generally want to blend in, not always. But the chameleon effect is adjusting one's behavior or thinking so that you can coincide with a group standard. The Ash experiment, Solomon Ash, studied the pressure of group on conformity. So the famous line experiment was done in 1950 to test levels of conformity. So in this experiment, there were 9 pseudo patients and one real or not patients, pseudo participants and one actual participant. He doesn't realize though that the other people are fake and they're in on the study. When they get in there, they're showing these participants lines on charts. And they ask them which line on the second chart is the same length as the first line. So here's our first line. Answer C is clearly the same as the first line. Well, most of the people in the group will say the wrong answer, A or B. So they want to see, will the participant go along and conform and say the wrong answer as well? And it kind of puts him in this uncomfortable situation. Everybody's saying this wrong answer and it gets to him and he's like, and they do this multiple times. And at first he doesn't conform, but then he starts to conform. He starts to think, well, maybe there's something maybe I'm not understanding the directions. So in the study, about a third of the trial participants regularly conformed to the unanimous but wrong group answer, with an average of 75% of all participants were conforming at least once through the experiment. So it was the wrong answer, but they conformed because they felt more comfortable to fit in with the group than to have the wrong answer and be sticking out from the group, or the right answer and stick out from the group. So, what are some things that influence our conformity? The size of the group. The more the people, the more likely one is to conform, especially when you start getting more than 3 people. The status of the group. The lower your status within the group, the more likely you're to conform. Observation of the group. If your decision is made in private and anonymous, you're less likely to conform. But if you have to do your response like verbally and out loud, then you more likely are want to blend with the group. And the I can't get that unanimity of the group. Conformity is greater when all in the group agree. So when all these other people were saying the wrong answer, then you're like, they're unanimous. I gotta be wrong. So he went along with it. We'll watch a video of that in class. Pretty famous one. Other reasons for conformity are normative social influence and informative social influence. So with normative social influence, we go along with the group because we want to avoid rejection or gain some kind of social approval. So we respect the group's norms. So that goes along with the Ash study. So he just wanted to blend in with the group. A lot of times our clothing choices follow the normative social influence. We're going with what society considers normal or acceptable. Informative social influence is due to the fact that the group may provide valuable information. We want to accept the opinions of others. So when we don't know what to do, we think that those people have valuable information, especially if it's a tougher decision and we don't want to stand alone. So if you were in a situation like you were in a foreign country and you didn't know what side of the road to drive on, following the others because you believe that they have valuable information so that you're driving on the same side of the road as they are would be an example of informative social influence. Compliance is when we adjust our behavior because of some implicit or explicit request. So, an explicit request is somebody actually saying, I need you to do this. Implicit is indirect, like I may hint around at it, like say, oh, I'm so tired. I wish I didn't have to do this. And then somebody will like, well, okay, well, I'll do it. They'll volunteer. So it was sort of implicit compliance, an indirect request. Indirect requests could include asking for or implying something else, like, oh, I didn't really mean for you to do it. And then, like, but maybe I did. Used by salespeople and politicians sometimes. Obedience is a change in behavior in response to a command of someone in a position of authority. So, compliance, there's a request involved. Obedience, it's a command. So, one of the most famous and controversial experiments in psychology was Milgram's obedience experiment. So, Stanley Milgram designed a study that investigated the effects of authority on obedience. So, this was following the atrocities of the Holocaust and World War II, and he wanted to know why so many people, particularly the German soldiers, were willing to comply with orders to follow through with the killing of Jewish people in the different camps. Like, why were these people willing to kill and hurt people, even though they think they might not have otherwise done that? So, in this experiment, let me go to my next slide. This was in 1962. He wanted to see what conditions there were. They had multiple participants come in, and they would, at one at a time, they'd be in a group of three, and they would draw a slip of paper saying whether or not they were a teacher, or what does it say here, a student or a teacher in the experiment. Now, what they didn't know is that it was rigged so that the participant would end up being the teacher, and somebody else who was in on the study would be the student. And then the experimenter was somebody else who was part of the study. And the participants were told as they came in that they were doing an experiment on the effects of punishment on learning. They were told that the student had to memorize a list of words and then he would have to recall them. But every time that he got a word wrong from recalling them from this list, he would receive a mild shock. And that's what's going on here. He's hooked up to this wire here, but the student is in one room, and then on the other side of a wall is the teacher. That's our participant. And then there's an experimenter in the room as well. Well, in front of the teacher is this big contraption saying that there's all these different levels of shocks that they can give. Let me see, we'll come back to these slides. So here's this, starting with mild all the way up to dangerous level shocks. So as the experiment goes on, the person gets the first few words right, but then he starts to miss some. So the teacher has to give the student a shock, and he misses again. And after a bit of doing this a few times, he can start to hear him moaning through the wall and saying things like, ouch, that hurts. Now, who was in this experiment? Milgram at first did the experiment with all males. And they were from various walks of life. Some were skilled, unskilled, others were white collar, some were professionals. And they were in different age groups, their 20s, their 30s, and their 40s. Beforehand, oh, here are some more of the details, sorry. After 75 volts were administered for a mistake, the learner would start to moan. After 90 volts, they would start to cry out in pain. After 180 volts, the learner screams, saying he can't stand the pain, and then he begins to bang on the wall. The psychiatrists who were asked ahead of time, what do you think will happen in this experiment? They predicted that most subjects would stop at 150 volts. That only a few would go as high as 300 volts, and maybe just like 1 in 1,000 would go all the way to the maximum voltage. Well, in 5 versions of the experiment, and we'll talk about the different versions in class. In the first version that was all men, 65% of them shocked all the way to the maximum value, to the point where like they could have killed them. The experimenter, if they were absent, so if there was not an experimenter there saying they had to continue on, only 21% continued. Women, when they did the experiment, 65% went all the way. And then if the experimenter chose the shock level, it only went about 2.5%. And they did this with high school students doing the shocks, and they went even further. 85% of them did the full shocks. By the way, the shocks were not real, but the person giving the shocks did not know that. In fact, they never knew that. Later on, Milgram eventually, well, I'll talk about later on the follow-ups and the debriefing. But why did these people obey? Why were they believing? I mean, they believed that they were really shocking somebody on the other side of this wall for missing questions on a vocabulary quiz. Most rationalized their obedience because they felt that the experimenter was ultimately responsible for what happened to the other participant. So the experimenter was saying, we need you to go on, keep doing this. And in some cases, the participant would say, well, who is responsible for this? And the experimenter would take responsibility and they'd say, all right, and they would keep going. Other influences, prestige. I think this was done at Harvard University. So there's this guy in a lab coat. It's this formal lab setting. There was this pressure that this was a formal setting. He's an authority figure. It was harder to disobey. Presence of others who disobeyed, they were the only one there giving these shocks. There was nobody else who was not conforming. So there wasn't a presence of others to kind of like sway them to not do it either. And then their own personality characteristics played a role. And when we look at some example videos, we'll see some people who didn't shock versus those who did. And we'll see what it was about their personality that made them obedient or not. But we'll talk about that one more in class. All right, moving on. Social dilemmas are situations in which selfish behavior that benefits individuals in the short run may spell disaster for an entire group in the long run. These are also called social traps. An example of this is the prisoner's dilemma. So in the prisoner's dilemma, we have two people who are separated immediately after they're arrested for a serious crime. The DA, the district attorney, the cop, believes they are guilty but lacks evidence. Each can either confess or not. So the DA tells them, if you both refuse to confess, each of you will be convicted of a minor offense and jailed for 1 year. If you both confess, the DA will recommend a 5-year sentence. If one remains silent and one confesses, the DA will allow the confessing prisoner to go free, whereas the other will serve the maximum 10-year sentence. Now, these two prisoners are not together. They're in a separate room, so they can't discuss this. So what would be the best situation for them? The best outcome is if they both compromised, if they both did not confess, because then they would just get this very short punishment. But is that going to happen? More often than not, because they'll have so selfish desires. So they'll both want to confess, thinking that the other one, they're going to hoping they're the only one who confesses, they'll go free, the other one gets 10 years. But they both do that, so they both confess and they both get, 5 years. All right, the next one, social facilitation. How do we behave in the presence of others? Social facilitation says that if we're doing a task in front of others, whether it's giving a speech, playing in a sport, dancing, anything like that, that we will do better on the task in front of others if there's a group. But this only occurs on a simple or a well-learned task. If you're trying to do something really difficult and you're trying to do that in front of others, or not necessarily it's difficult, but it's new to you, you're not necessarily going to do better in front of others. And when you do worse in front of others because of the group, that's called social inhibition. That's the opposite of social facilitation. So the negative influence of others leads you to a decrease in performance because you perceive that the crowd is judging you or they're evaluating you. Social loafing, this one teachers know about. The tendency for people in a group to exert less effort than working individually. So the bigger the group, the tendency to have some social loafers. We've got the group working over here. There's always that one person who's not doing their part. Why is that? They feel less accountable when they're in the group. They may feel that their contribution is dispensable or they're not important. So that's why a lot of times teachers don't want to have groups much bigger than 3 people, because it increases the chance of social loafing. Or you guys would just say there's a lazy person or a slacker in the group. De-individuation, also known as mob mentality, is your loss of self-awareness and self-restraint in group situations that foster arousal and anonymity. So in a mob, when there's a large group of people, with de-individuation, no one can point you out, or you at least feel like no one can point you out. So again, you feel less accountable for your individual actions. So people will do things that they normally wouldn't. You're not just going to go out with your best friend and go riot and start fires in the street, tipping over cars. But when there's a large group, people are more likely to do stuff like that. Group polarization says that groups' prevailing attitudes enhance through discussion. And if the group is like-minded, the group strengthens its prevailing opinions. And if they're not, then they divide even more. So let's say we've got fans of Justin Bieber in a room. We've got ones who love him and ones who hate him. When they get in the groups, the ones who love him will strengthen. They'll talk about, oh yeah, remember that first video? And oh yeah, we just loved him. And they'll really kind of enhance their prevailing attitude. Whereas the other ones who are haters, they're going to talk about all the things they dislike, and they'll actually become stronger in their views. So the groups will polarize. They'll become stronger towards the opposite ends, towards their view. So it can be beneficial or harmful. The bottom line, you usually leave more fired up. So that's why, like, if somebody goes to a political rally, you know, they already kind of liked that candidate, but when they get there and there's all those other people who like that candidate too, then they really get excited about that candidate. But it can also go in the negative direction as well, as far as disliking something. Groupthink is a way of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in a decision making overrides the possible alternatives. So with groupthink, we have a group that's isolated in their decision making, and they want to come up with a decision so they can agree on something, but it's not always the best decision. And maybe the group is not willing to speak up because they want to try to preserve the harmony of the group. So somebody doesn't want to make waves, so they go along with the rest of the group's decision or the decision of the most vocal member. So when does this occur? When the group members are unable to evaluate other available options. So if they're in a hurry or they just don't have it anywhere else to a chance to try to consider other options, and when they can't comprehend negative consequences. I like this meme here. Groupthink. Who needs good ideas when you can all agree on a bad idea? Carrying that boat like that's not a great idea. Some other conditions for groupthink. This happens when the group is isolated from the outside. So sometimes thinking of like top government officials who are making decisions on their own. In theory, they have advisors and cabinets, and they shouldn't be making decisions on their own to try to eliminate that. This could be like school board decision making, or leaders in a corporation. But if they're making the decisions on their own and not hearing outside opinions, they could be prone to groupthink. When there are time limits, when people are rushed, when they're not having an impartial leader. So when there's a strong vocal leader in the group, people tend to want to just kind of go along with what that person is saying. We'll look at some examples of that in class. All right, that's all of Flipped Notes 9-2 on social influence.